good evening, good afternoon to all of you, wherever you are streaming in from. I'm Jacqui True. I'm a Professor of International Relations at Monash University in Melbourne, Australia. And I also at Monash direct the Gender, Peace and Security Centre. And at Monash GPS, as we like to call it, we aim to bring gender perspectives to address and deliver more inclusive peace and security globally, as well as in the Indo-Pacific region. And we have really a large cohort of PhD students. I think we have the largest cohort of PhD students working on aspects of gender, peace and security, the largest program in the world. So we have, about 20 students from 18 countries, all working on a range of different topics. So maybe I'll just put a brief pitch. If this is something that really interests you, we'd love to hear from you. And we have had also a lot of events this year. And you're very welcome to follow us on Twitter, on Facebook, and to join any of our events. Thanks, Callista.
Yeah, no, thank you, Jacqui, for joining us tonight and also accommodating the time difference. We are very delighted to have you here. So firstly, I will kick off the discussion by asking a few questions. And if the audience would like to ask a question, please submit the question via the Zoom chat and I can ask it on your behalf. Or if you would like to ask the question yourself, please raise your virtual hand on Zoom so that I can call on you later. So Jacqui, I guess the first question I'll start with would be, how does gender manifest as an organizing logic in international relations?
Well, great. Thank you for that question, Callista. And I think, the first thing to think about is the sort of defining dichotomies that through which we understand international relations. And I think the two major ones would be the dichotomy between war and peace, and that between domestic politics and international politics. And both of those are understood and are defined in part through gendered assumptions and hierarchies. So, for example, war is seen as, for a large part of world history, war has been seen as men's business. And moreover, it has been seen as where men are made, that wars make men and men make wars. So it's been really crucial to defining masculine identity and development as citizens, and women and anything associated with women has been seen as entirely out of place in war, on the sidelines, on the home front. And peace has, to some extent, been what we might call feminized or devalued or associated with the lesser option, and something that's somehow the weaker option. And I think that that really that in a way the promotion of sort of masculine identities as being very much connected to war making and killing has really been to the detriment of humanity, including many men, but also the association of peace with women and with the feminine has sort of also devalued it and underrated it. And that defining dichotomy continues to define international relations and the way in which we understand it. And then when we look at sort of the division between domestic politics and international politics, which is sort of course, an abstraction, because in the world we live, that there is very much a porous boundary between countries, but also between politics within and across countries. And yet we have often seen international politics, the politics of national and international security in particular, as requiring sort of, as being not only the domain of men, but requiring those who are brave and those who are the most rational the most objective and those who are able, who have this kind of masculine authority. And while domestic politics has been, in a way, sort of seen as, associated with the home front, with domesticity, and often seen as, relatively less important. Now, even while that may shift and change, I think, and we can see that changing now, nonetheless, the kind of association of international politics with the ability to command military weapons and make decisions about the use of force and the use of weapons, and the extent to which that has been linked to whether or not you as an individual or a leader has fought in wars. I think all of those associations are very much tied to the gender divisions, the gender roles that historically have existed. And therefore, much of how we think about international relations remains framed by the limits of our gender identities. So one question I often ask myself, and I would definitely ask all of you, is to think about, when you think about international politics and international security, think about through whose identity do we conceive of, or do you seek security? What does security mean to you? And do you see security as requiring protection from a strong, a strong, authoritative, rational leader or military force, or do you see security in a different way, perhaps associated with acts of care, acts of solidarity, acts of cooperation? Yes, I'll leave that there, and we hope can continue the conversation.
Yeah, thank you for providing us with a very succinct explanation of how the international system is in fact gendered. I would like to pick up on your point when you talk about how peace is feminized versus military force as something that's masculine and something that is that requires bravery from the part of men who are making these decisions, whether to deploy force or not. With the evolution, like after the Second World War, we have seen the rise of international organizations like the United Nations, whose mission is to promote peace and international security. So in a very interesting way, we see these concepts being brought together. And I would just like to seek your thoughts on this matter. Do you see the definitions of international security evolving along with the rise of such international organizations? Because now it is conflated with the idea of peace and what we would assume is a more feminized version of how we order politics and how we behave in the international arena.
Yes, I think the United Nations, of course, and the establishment of the UN in 1945 as, our preeminent peace organization with a core mission in the UN Charter to prevent conflict, is a really important development and constraint on that kind of history of masculine war. And yet I would say that if we think about, the efforts to promote the UN, and to fund and resource the UN and its core activities to prevent war, I think they have often failed. Like, many states have failed to support the UN. They have undermined it in their practices, and that the UN probably has failed to live up to its mandate and its mission, though that doesn't mean that it cannot continue to aspire to it. And I think it's partly because many states don't sort of undermine the mission of peace in various different ways. So and the UN itself in its peace operations has also largely failed to keep the peace as well. Now, partly because of the lack of, state support. So, I think many people would say, we know that, 90% of wars occurring in countries that have previously been at war. So we have this pattern of recurring conflict and violence. And whilst we might have been able to prevent nuclear war so far, we do actually have increasing conflict, especially in the last 5 to 6 years. We are seeing increasing violence worldwide, and that is, just looking at state and non-state violence.
So thank you for that, Jacqui. And I guess to tap on the point that you've raised earlier, between the dichotomy between domestic politics and international politics, would you say that countries with more patriarchal societies, so countries where gender inequality is more rampant and more severe, tend to be more predisposed to conflict and violence in the international arena? So I guess here I'm tapping on this second image theory, or the assumption that domestic politics do influence states' behavior in the international system. And I would like to ask for your thoughts on this.
Yeah, that's great. And I think that really important contribution of feminist international relations is to connect the condition and the aspiration of gender equality within societies and so-called domestic politics, and the extent to which that creates more stable and less violent, less conflictual international relations. So I think that, there's an increasing body of scholarship and evidence now that shows us that more gender equal societies are less violent societies, and that that societies that, what maybe to say even more than gender equality in terms of men and women, but also to say societies with prevailing social norms that strongly support equality, and are much more likely to be societies that are peaceful and stable. I think even to say more, maybe on the other side of that, is to say that societies that institutionalized or have embedded, have not challenged kind of masculine honor ideologies or sexist attitudes, including justification for types of violence against women, which are wide-ranging, can be everything from marital rape to female genital mutilation or early marriage. So societies that condone those kinds of practices and also, subscribe to a masculine honor ideology, those societies in particular tend to laud leaders who play up their sort of masculine, hyper-masculine warrior type leadership, and also leaders who seek to undermine women's rights and actually gain support for that. So those societies are all primed for war, primed for conflict, within themselves and internationally. So that means that then one of the best ways to prevent war and prepare for peace is to promote gender equality and to promote more inclusive attitudes.
Thank you. So I guess picking up on your point about feminist international theory, I guess one very important academic strand within this larger theory of international relations from a feminist standpoint would be the Women, Peace and Security Agenda. So Jacqui, I know that you're very heavily involved in research in this respect. So could you very briefly tell us about the origins and evolution of the Women, Peace and Security Agenda, and how does it challenge conventional approaches to international relations?
Big question, but really happy to answer it. So one of the, I traced the Women, Peace and Security Agenda back a century, and I connect it, and I think, I'm not the only one to do this, but I connect it to women's peace activism during World War I. And particularly, women from across 12 countries, Europe and Americas, who came together to try to prevent World War I, and to try to talk to leaders at the time, about a plan for peace. And of course, they did not succeed. And those women peace activists at the time themselves did not have political rights. So they weren't citizens, they were subjects. And many were prevented from traveling to The Hague in the Netherlands, where they convened in 1915 the International Conference of Women on Peace. And so the women, and that conference came up with 20 principles, and those principles really connected gender equality, social justice, and the prevention of war and conflict. And it came up with resolutions which are very similar to the resolutions that we see today through the UN Security Council under the cross-cutting thematic agenda of women, peace and security. So they were, about trying to, for a start, promote women's participation in peace negotiations, and try to turn the attention to the impact of war on civilians, and particularly the negative impact on the most vulnerable members of society of conflict, on the importance of having neutral countries be mediators for peace, and the importance of having real negotiations where, both parties to conflict were able to negotiate an end to conflict. They were also very, it was a strongly disarmament agenda. They wanted to see the regulation of arms, and they understood that part of what fueled war was the arms industry, the economic interest in war. So they had many proposals, and they presented them to leaders, including Woodrow Wilson. They did manage to get a meeting, at least the two leaders, Jane Addams and Emily Balch, I think, and Alice Paul. And whilst they, at the time there was, no traction, and there were just really derogatory comments about these women in all of the major newspapers, the London Times, the New York Times. And you can go and look at the archives now and see the cartoons that were drawn of these women. The French government actually prevented women, put them in prison, prevented them from reaching the peace conference. But what's so interesting is that Woodrow Wilson, many of these principles were reflected in his 14-point plan that led to the establishment of the League of Nations. And then if you look at the establishment of the United Nations, and there, of course, you have Eleanor Roosevelt there at the founding, you can see you can also see their presence there, especially, in terms of, equal rights for men and women being right there at the founding of the United Nations. And then with the Women, Peace and Security Agenda, that peace activism continued throughout the century, that activism against war, against militarism, against nuclear weapons. And that led to the adoption of Resolution 1325, now 20 years ago. And so it's really important to understand that, unlike other resolutions on the UN Security Council, that Resolution 1325 was promoted and advocated for by a transnational social movement. So that, unlike other international relations theories which have developed and evolved through scholarly, largely nationalistic scholarly communities, I would say, that the Women, Peace and Security Agenda has been promoted by largely feminist or women and men activists outside of scholarly institutions, outside of state institutions, and transnationally. So it reflects really different standpoints and really different, and a kind of knowledge base based on the experience of, on the ground, of trying to prevent war, or also understanding the reality of what war actually is like. Both for those who fight it, especially the young men, predominantly, but also for those who are, affected as civilians in many different ways. So, just to come back to your point of what is your point about in other international relations approaches, and what is different about women, peace and security. And maybe one thing I would say, and I think it's a really important point, women, peace and security is not a niche agenda. It's not just about women. It's unfortunately titled wrongly. In my view, it should be called a gender, peace and security agenda, or an equality, peace and security agenda. And it's called Women, Peace and Security because that was more acceptable to states. States, including like Russia, who seem to think that connotes a kind of a traditional gender role where women are inherently biologically linked, able to promote peace, which is of course not what women peace activists have been promoting and arguing for more than a century. Rather, women, peace and security at its base is a gender equality, social justice and peace agenda. And it applies and is relevant to everyone. It is trying to rebalance peace and security for all, and to promote alternative forms of conflict resolution. And in the process, we have found that it actually does matter to have more diverse representation in peace processes in terms of actually being able to come to an agreement and stop the guns. So there's now like a real rational case for why it matters. But unfortunately, coining it women, peace and security sometimes means that it is assumed to be, it is relegated and devalued, just as women have been in international relations, seen as somehow outside of international relations or, you know, unimportant.
No, thank you for that. I think it's I think you raised a really pertinent point by pointing out how the very term of women, peace and security agenda already kind of casts it aside from, you know, power politics and the agenda that is commonly seen in international systems. So I guess bringing your point back to how you raised that Russia is more, I guess, more traditionally masculine oriented in their security approaches, where they think that traditionally women should be relegated to peacemaking roles or maybe to the domestic sphere. May I ask for your opinions on what you see the current status of the Women, Peace and Security Agenda as, given that this year we note that there is no new UNSC resolution marking the anniversary of the agenda, with Russia as the chair of the Security Council, and the United Nations Security Council is also arguably the apex of masculine policy-making institutions, where, you know, policies of international peace and security are being struck. So how has power politics also impeded the implementation of this agenda for social justice and for greater equality in policymaking?
Great, so much to respond to there, Callista. Look, I mean, I'm quite an optimist. Maybe I should say, you know, what is it that Gramsci said, you know, pessimism of the intellect and optimism of the will is really important. So I'll just start with the optimism of the will. I think if we, just in terms of the current state of the Women, Peace and Security Agenda, well, it has grown to be a massive community of theory and practice globally. So I think we have to recognize that. And what is so amazing is to see more and more people from different backgrounds, different experiences, including of conflict and crises, including states, have come, are now actually making statements, engaging in debates about gender, peace and security. So I think it's an incredibly, the current state of women, peace and security it's incredibly healthy, shall we say, to the extent that more and more people and actors are engaged in contestation and debate in this realm. And that's a positive. And if you just, even since we are in universities, I mean, if you just think about the growth of it in universities, in terms of the student interest and the classes offered in this field, it's a massive growth. When I was at your point, there was nothing offered. So we were the crazy people who wrote dissertations on women, the state and war. Which was really crazy at the time. This is not crazy now. So just to say that. And then this year, there was no resolution. Thank goodness. We have 10 resolutions. Can we just implement them, please? We don't need another resolution. But what is so interesting about a country like Russia, which is actively contesting the Women, Peace and Security Agenda, which is trying to promote an alliance of states to promote women's and men's traditional roles, and to promote certainly promoting women in peace building, because that is seen, as you said, like domestic work, caring work, traditional work of women. So they are trying to set back many of the political goals associated with the Women, Peace and Security Agenda, and they see many issues that are related to human rights as not appropriately security issues. But what is fascinating is that now Russia actually nonetheless put itself in a situation trying to have a resolution on this agenda. So they are actually having to actively engage in it. And then, you know, even though they did it very poorly and in such a contrary way, that activated all of the other states to up their support, their positive support and contestation for the agenda. So, and then you have new countries like Indonesia, like Vietnam, being like South Africa, being really strong advocates for gender equality in peacekeeping and peacemaking. And so, you know, that, you know, I have written an article with Anshe Veena, and actually we first met at Oxford University, and the article's called "Everyone Wants a Piece of It, the Women, Peace and Security Agenda." It's a bit like motherhood and apple pie. So everybody wants to be for it. So what happens is that because it does challenge some of the assumptions of peace and security and how you should deliver peace and security, is that contestation has to occur in this much more co-opting, you know, sort of counter-hegemonic way, which Russia has been engaging in, but not successfully. I don't know if many of you looked at Twitter after the open debate in the Security Council. I think it was on 29th of October. Russia put out that it tried to put a resolution and it didn't get enough votes in the Security Council. Their tweets were virtually not retweeted or liked by anyone. So they are completely out in the cold. They've really lost face there. Meanwhile, you have, you know, very significant new countries, rising powers, starting to actually actively support this agenda. So I think that's really, really interesting. And I think it speaks to the endurance of the agenda and that it will go forward. And for me, what is really important about any terrain of politics is that if more and more people and actors have access to debate in that realm, then it has a real, you know, we can expect further advances, even though it's an ongoing struggle, always.
Yeah, thank you for that. You talked about there being a very strong rhetorical commitment from, you know, traditionally more, I guess, conservative societies on matters of gender equality. And I was just wondering how we can translate this rhetorical commitment into successful institutionalization. So I guess just to strike an example in point, so Australia had adopted its first national action plan on the Women, Peace and Security Agenda back in 2012, and the second iteration of it is in the works. But there is still, while there is a strong rhetorical commitment to gender equality and greater inclusiveness in policy making, the action plan is criticized by some for failing to facilitate, you know, vertical diffusion of the agenda, where we translate this rhetoric into sustainable action and apply it to our foreign policy. So I would just like to tap your brain on this. How are we supposed to institutionalize the Women, Peace and Security Agenda successfully and not just let it lose steam and be confined to, you know, academic circles and you know, rhetorical commitments in the United Nations?
Well, I think first of all, it's really important to note that the Women, Peace and Security Agenda now is being institutionalized in many different sites and institutions, not only the UN. So, you know, in organizations like NATO, in regional organizations like even ASEAN and in Southeast Asia, in obviously other kinds of security communities like the Organization for Security and Cooperation in Europe. It's being institutionalized in local action plans, for example, in Indonesia, in Iraq, in regional, I mentioned the African Union, other regional organizations. So there's many different sites now. So we can't just look at the UN Security Council and think that's what it's all about. It's diffused and multiplied and increasingly being localized, so being implemented in context-specific ways. And then in all of those sites, there are key actors who are, not only those inside institutions, but also those in social movements and civil society organizations and on the ground who are using the agenda to promote more inclusive participation in security, in the security sector and in security policy making and on particular issues. And also to actually, they're also using the agenda to, highlight the real protection failures in our international humanitarian and peacekeeping system. So there's lots of ways it's being used. And so it's not just a matter of looking at national action plans. Again, I guess integral to a feminist perspective on international relations is to note the states are not the only actors, and change does not only come from within the state. It comes from across, it comes from networks of actors who build coalitions and who promote change through their connections, both inside and outside of institutions. So just to take the Australian example, because of course I'm living here and I'm a citizen and I know it well. Yes, Australia has a second national action plan. They've had one for a year, a second one for a year. They haven't launched it. It's a classic example of what Antje Wiener and I talk about, again, with other colleagues, some of whom were PhD students at Oxford. We talk about its indirect contestation. So they talk the talk in the UN Security Council, and they get the they oppose the Russian resolution, but then they don't actually launch their national action plan, and they don't resource it. So they look good in the world, but they don't actually do the work back at home. But fortunately, such as the first national action plan held many different government agencies responsible for key actions. And those agencies some of them have taken it very seriously and have created, for example, Australian Defence Force has created targets for women's participation at all ranks and in all services. They have their own, a plan of implementation. They have their own monitoring and evaluation framework. They are chipping away at the kind of, warrior, masculine hero culture, and they are transforming it from within. And they are doing that with the assistance of this transnational women, peace and security agenda, which they can use to hold accountable their own hierarchies. So we can see quite significant change. One thing I just would say about change is that having got to middle age, but also being really someone who appreciates history and finds it really important to also look back at history and understand the previous struggles. If we look at the longue durée, we can see that's where we can see social change. We don't see it tomorrow or next year, or even, in the time we're at university, but we do see change. And I can, say that it is a long revolution, women, peace and security, but that change is happening. And, it's the momentum is there. And even if one particular government and one particular minister doesn't launch their national action plan, well, so be it, because you're not getting on the boat, everyone else is. And now they will be quite embarrassed because Indonesia is doing so much more to promote that agenda, and likewise Vietnam. So I like to think in this realm, a little bit of state competition could be quite healthy in terms of promoting all of these initiatives and alternative conflict resolution, conflict prevention approaches that we have at the heart of the Women, Peace and Security agenda.
No, I think that's a much healthier competition as opposed to a military arms race, you know, competing to be more inclusive in their policy making agenda. So before I ask my next question, I would just like to remind the audience that you're very welcome to raise any questions that you have. I think Jacqui would be very happy to answer them. So if you would like to just type your question in the chat or just raise your hand so that I can call on you later for you to ask the question to Jacqui yourself. So thanks, Ella. Just one last question before I get to you. So something that I'm really interested about is that some countries, mainly in the Scandinavia, like Sweden and Denmark, have implemented an explicitly feminist foreign policy. So these policies you know, espouse a very strong commitment to taking into consideration issues such as sexual and gender-based violence in their foreign policy, and also sought to include more inclusive, you know, voices in foreign policy making. But some of these policies have been criticized for adopting a binary conceptualization of gender, where we look at male versus female, but at the expense of marginalizing voices that do not conform to the gender binary. So I was just wondering, how can we actually incorporate more intersectional approaches in gender mainstreaming in policy making, and how do you see this being done in future? Thank you.
Yeah, lots of questions there, Callista. I think women, peace and security is an intersectional agenda, actually. I think that, you know, one of the key insights in the agenda is understanding how particular, especially minority groups of women and girls are targeted for sexual and gender-based violence and conflict. So it's not just, you know, it's, and that also how sexual minorities are also targeted with the very same strategies, because they are also seen as feminine, weak, other, and those strategies of war are also played out on their bodies as battlefields. So in effect, the methodologies at the heart of gender analysis or feminist theory really apply to really try to understand the complexity of identity and security, and understand how the gender binary is actually applied to a whole range of different groups, not just women or a particular group of women. And I think if we look at Sweden's feminist foreign policy, Sweden having a feminist government and having a male leader, stating a prime minister stating that, you know, they're a feminist government, and then translating that into their foreign policy, that is, the way Sweden does that is also through a human rights-based approach that doesn't discriminate based on sex or gender identity. It does put women's participation at the heart, because in many societies, the gender binary is not just about identity, it's about the subordination of women structurally in those societies. Now, not to say that other groups aren't also affected. So I think I think that feminist foreign policy is an evolving movement. It's not just something adopted by a few states, it's an evolving movement, and how we think about how applying that is something very much requiring that intersectional analysis. And in order to, actually bring about that greater equality and social justice, which hopefully can drive, more peaceful outcomes.
Thank you so much for that. Ella, would you like to unmute yourself to ask your question now?
Yes, I will.
Nice to see your face too. Yeah.
Video.
Thank you.
Yeah, thank you for your both of you, for a very interesting talk. What I would like to ask you about is the role of the national level NGOs in building effective national agendas on the state level. So my experience has been, I'm from Finland, and when the implementation strategies for the Women, Peace and Security resolution, as well as the Youth, Peace and Security resolution have been made, there has been a very strong NGO involvement, where the NGOs have been able to bring about ideas as well as expertise to how these strategies were best implemented, but they have engaged mainly NGOs from the Finnish context. So I haven't really looked into this much, but what would be your view on the prospects of achieving effective national agendas in countries where the NGOs or the civil society is repressed and there isn't like resources in a similar extent? Where can we draw in those cases the power to create effective agendas?
Thanks, Ella. A really good question. And actually enables me to come back to the question of feminist foreign policy. And I think the countries that have adopted feminist foreign policy, one of the things that they have really prioritized is core funding for women's rights, human rights advocacy organizations, especially in conflict-affected, fragile countries. They have, indirectly trying to build up the civil society movements in those countries. And those movements themselves are responsible for the agendas they want to bring to bear, for the concerns they have, and for, bringing their needs and priorities to their own governments. But I guess what, societies that are relatively more stable and have devoted, want to have a peacemaking role internationally by devoting, significant amount of their aid budget to actually promoting those pro-peace movements. That's a core commitment, a core investment. And that we need to see that. Now, some countries, I'm not sure about Finland, but certainly, Sweden, certainly the UK, to some extent, Australia, certainly have, highlighted priority countries where they really do want to give that support, and give that support to especially, women's civil society organizations in particular, because they are often the least resourced, the least funded among civil society organizations in societies where civil society organizations have a hard time coexisting often with authoritarian or repressive states. So that's really important. And why is it important? Because we know that societies which have strong civil society movements, and particularly have strong women's participation, are much more likely to get to yes, to have a resolution to conflict, and to be able to sustain that peace. So it matters. It just doesn't matter because we think it's a nice thing to do. It matters because it's actually been shown to work, and in part because why? Because civil society groups and particularly women have an interest in peace. They have a standpoint experiencing the impact of war and conflict and having to cope with the trauma, the injury, the poverty that flows from that, and having experience trying to resolve conflicts from the community level every day. So I think that is really important to join up those movements, and for progressive states that want to put feminism at the heart of their foreign policy, that is the number one thing that they must do. They must support those local movements for peace and justice.
Thank you very much. That was a great answer. Thank you.
Yeah, thank you so much, Jacqui, and also for Ella for asking that question. Do we have any more questions from the audience? So I think we don't have any questions for now, but then I would like to ask one myself. So currently we see that, the United Nations is kind of enlarging or its kind of scope of intervention by invoking Chapter 7 of the UN Charter, and redefining what state sovereignty means and what non-intervention means. So I think one of the most significant or symbolic political commitment to the protection of human rights would be the responsibility to protect doctrine, where, you know, international intervention is allowed under the circumstances of violation of human rights, mass killings of people within the state, and so on. But on the other hand, there are also, you know, arguments against the R2P as, you know, like a promoter of human rights, because they reinforce like common stereotypes of women being passive and in need of protection, especially from crimes relating to sexual and gender-based violence. So I was just wondering whether you see this, the R2P doctrine, as a step to advance the women, peace and security agenda, or as a step backward in this sense, because symbolically the R2P agenda kind of relies on the importation of expertise, top-down, you know, enforcement rather than bottom-up, like local empowerment, that we see the WPS agenda as something that's transnational, something that originates within civil societies. So I was just wondering about that.
No, great. Like those are really great thoughts, Callista. I really like the way you put it. What I would say is the R2P agenda needs women, peace and security more than the other way around. And why is that? For the very reasons that you spoke about. I think what's really important about the R2P agenda is the responsibility to prevent, and the kind of attention to the early warning mechanisms, and the mobilization of civil societies as part of that prevention agenda. And I think what, you know, people often focus, when they focus on R2P, they do focus on, you know, the challenge to the state sovereignty principle, and that responsibility to protect citizens of other states where their state is not protecting them, and that therefore authorizing military action. And I think that you know, that has you know, been somewhat discredited. But I think there's this whole other part of the R2P agenda that's very well aligned with the women, peace and security agenda. But I think it's really interesting what happened historically is that you have the emergence of these two agendas at the same time, although women, peace and security does come before, but sort of at the same time in silos. And it's almost like the masculine agenda and the feminine agenda, which is not good, right? We don't want that kind of siloing, that kind of binary within the way we promote peace. But, you know, and the communities around those agendas were somewhat distinct and not intersecting. And I think that's been a problem, because the way in which protection, I think, as you said very well, was conceived within the R2P agenda did not include, you know, inclusive protection of all civilians. And certainly, really, it did not address the use of sexual and gender-based violence against, you know, diverse people, really, as a key issue fueling conflict, and needing to be part of the responsibility to prevent. So I think it has been a gender biased or a gender flawed agenda to its own disadvantage. But I do see that there's much room for some collaboration and solidarity across those two agendas, especially as the R2P agenda, you know, promotes a much more community-based, prevention-based approach to, you know, to responsibility, I guess. Yeah. And if no one else has another question, I mean, I think it's always interesting to go back to that question about, you know, how that you asked me earlier, which I didn't completely answer, which is how a feminist perspective, you know, what it brings to international relations that's different from conventional perspectives. And, you know, I think you've already encapsulated that, but obviously, you know, deeply rooted in most international relations theories is a certain assumption about human nature, which is almost entirely based on observations and experiences of men living in gender unequal societies. So, and realist assumptions that that war is something that we always need to prepare for, because, you know, human nature is brutish, nasty, or whatever Hobbes said, remains a really flawed understanding. And also the notion that preparing for war could protect us from violence is also deeply flawed. But at the same time, the liberal agenda, to some extent, which is associated with the development of the UN, is also somewhat flawed, because it doesn't address the deep-rooted grievances that lie in social and economic inequalities within and across countries. So that the liberal internationalist agenda, in particular, that promotes the notion of peace will come about because everybody has an economic interest in international cooperation and trade, in the greater prosperity that comes from integration. That also is based on really neglecting the inequalities that come with global integration, including the gendered inequalities that come there. So I think that really important to see that whilst there might be overlaps between all lenses or perspectives on international relations, I think the feminist perspective is nonetheless somewhat distinct.
Thank you so much, Jacqui. I think that was a very thoughtful contribution to my question earlier on how feminist theory contributes to our understanding of international relations. So thank you very much, Conrad, for typing your question. But I think Jamie reached out to me privately to ask if he could ask a question. So Jamie, would you like to ask your question before we go on to Conrad's one?
Sure, thanks, Calista. So my question, thank you very much also for your talk. This is really fascinating, and I entirely agree with everything you said. My question is simply, do you feel that there is ever kind of a point where war is justified or valid? And if so, do you think there's a specific approach that the gendered kind of thinking about peace and international conflicts can bring to that, and how war should go ahead if it is valid, justified?
Thanks. I just lost your name.
Sorry, my name Jamie. Jamie.
Okay, that's right. You're from the Journal. Thanks, Jamie. That's a great question, and I'm no philosopher, but I do think that there are some feminist scholars who would look at certain scenarios and say that the use of force is justified in order to protect and uphold human rights. But what does that mean? I would say the use of force rather than war per se. And I think we can all think of situations where we would think it was justified to use force to protect atrocities, mass atrocities. I would have liked to have seen the use of force in Rwanda. I believe that the responsible legal use of force in Rwanda could have stopped that genocide. And from a feminist perspective, I think that would, I think that's, quite well aligned with humanitarian impact. But also to note that, I'm not going to be able to quote off by heart, but violence begets violence. So it cannot be used in an unregulated way. And it should only be in situations which are, where the atrocities are such that, it's a measured use of force. But in most cases, I think that for me as a scholar, I would like to focus on all of my efforts on thinking about all of the other approaches to prevention of such situations, knowing that violence and the use of force rarely is effective, almost never is effective. It always it fuels grievances in the next generation, and it also normalizes the use of force as a way to resolve conflicts. And I would like to see violence in this way outlawed. So However, I'm not a pacifist, but I would say that I think that there are really valid arguments for revolutionary pacifism, noting that we need to resource and we need to think through all of the other options, and they are rarely given the time, the resources, and the attention. But clearly there are crises. As we transition to a non-violent society, there are crises to which we must respond, and which as a last resort, in the last instance, force is useful.
Thank
So
you
a
very much.
utilitarian argument.
Great. Thank you so much, Jamie and Jacqui, for your response. So now I'll be going on to Conrad's question. I wonder if Jacqui can access the chat, but then I'll just read it out for those of us who are on mobile or something. So Conrad asks a question regarding the methodology and ontology of analyzing politics through a gendered lens. And he asks that inasmuch as the ideas of masculinity as domineering and forceful, whilst femininity as domestic and less violent are certainly true, even in a socially constructed sense, there is still a strong current in social justice to do away with any essentialism in the first place, and for some elements of masculinity, for example, violence, to do away with these features as elements of masculinity themselves. So it seems to me that then, unless the role of masculinity is sufficient for the nature of war, conflict, and international security as we see it, this sort of analysis will hold on to particular ideas of masculinity and femininity as wider currents in social justice, attempt to reinterpret this binary entirely. How then does the inherent flexibility of these concepts, paired with the ongoing pressure to reconstruct these concepts, square with wanting to understand international relations as gendered? And what does this look like for the field in the future?
Great. Thanks, Conrad. Maybe just a very simple answer to that quite complex question. I think in order to transform the gender relations that underlie and that fuel war and division, we need to, in order to transform them, we need to understand them. And we need to understand how they work. And I agree with you that these gendered identities are socially constructed and reconstructed every day in everything that we do, and that sometimes we reinforce them even as we're trying to understand them. And I think that they work in different ways in different societies. So, it's highly dynamic. So, for example, to just do away and not to think that gender is at all relevant, because in Western societies we now are accepting a much more fluid understanding of gender identity, will not enable us to understand how that gender binary continues to pervade our institutions, including our institutions that make decisions about the use of resources and the use of force. So I think we have to have a kind of a contingent, provisional approach when we are a social constructivist, and we have to sort of understand that while things, whilst any identities, any are provisional, are dynamic, are fluid, are processes, that they do have certain, there are certain norms and ideas that do have effects, and those include binary gender, and that is not going to go away, even at the same time as we are challenging that idea of binary gender. So I guess, that's a little, maybe not as clear as I'd like it to be, but we need to understand how they work, and they work in the binary gender continues to structure our thinking, our lives, but importantly our institutions. And so in order to reconstruct our institutions, we do actually have to understand how gender works. So I think, what does that mean for the future? I think it's a really fascinating field. Like, if I just take one example of, say, let's take the example of military institutions. and to think about what does it mean to have more inclusive and diverse militaries in terms of the participation of not just those who subscribe to the masculine warrior hero, but those who subscribe to, other identities, and certainly don't reflect the traditional warrior or soldier being the male or white or Western or whatever. So I think it's really interesting to think about what happens to that institution, what happens to the activity of protection. What does it mean to protect when you come from a socially constructed identity that has been historically seen as the protected? What are the ways in which you carry out the task of protection? And how do you encounter, and what does that mean when you're internationally deployed? And I actually think what is happening with more inclusive militaries is we are actually expanding the tool set of what it means to protect and what it means to provide security. And that more diverse and inclusive militaries are getting better at listening to people who are in war zones, who are affected by conflict, and they're learning new types of conflict resolution skills that don't only involve the use of force. So that's just one example, and I'm sure you could pull out any example and start to ask yourself what happens when gender identities are changing, and how does that change institutions, and then how is that going to transform international relations? And I do believe that transformations in gender identities do have flow-on effects for our institutions and for our international relations. That's why I study it.
Thank you, Jacqui, and for Conrad for asking the question as well. So I think we have 2 more questions before the end of the talk. And Carlotta, would you like to ask your question?
Thank you. Thank you both of you for that. Well, thank you, Callista, for your great questions, and for that great talk. My question is less theoretical and more on sort of the practical side of how to implement these approaches in teaching. So at an undergraduate level, where there's obviously like a lot of ground to cover, should and how can international relations take into account more of a feminist approach without sort of sidelining that as, well, this is international relations, and then there's also this somewhere? Is it kind of a complete overhaul of what goes on at an undergraduate level, or what are your thoughts on that?
Yeah, it's a long time since I've taught first year international relations, but I have been teaching third year gender and international relations. I'm really inspired by some colleagues around the world who start their introduction to international relations with kind of perspectives of, those who might be seen as most they start with post-colonial perspectives, they start with feminist perspectives, they start with different voices and different understandings of international relations or relations international. And then, so they don't privilege the same historical narrative and the same way of knowing international relations as this sort of primarily state-centric study based on, primarily Western tellings of particular wars and particular male decision makers in the interlude. So I actually think, upending the study and actually forcing us to think about, what are the key dynamics, the key actors, and how do we understand, the construction of international relations, and from what standpoint do we understand it? I think is a much more engaging way to also think about what it might mean to transform and to create more equal and more just global politics.
Thank you so much.
Yeah, thank you so much, Jacqui, and for Carlota for asking a question as well. So we have one last question from Rebecca, and I'll read it out. So on the topic of gender-based violence, there is the danger of missing the everyday violence which occurs when we discuss the Women, Peace and Security agenda in relation to conflict. How do we overcome this issue while recognizing the detrimental effects of war on women and children? And finally, how is the Women, Peace and Security agenda countering the essentialism of women as innately peaceful?
Great question. Thanks, Rebecca. Well, I think the feminist concept of a continuum of violence is really important, and it actually disrupts that war-peace dichotomy I started talking about, and it disrupts the notion of peace and security as something that happens over there or in that so-called officially recognized conflict place. So to understand that conflict is actually happening in many homes around the world, that the home that we assume to be the safest place for everyone is often the most violent place for women and children, which starts to disrupt our understanding of insecurity, and again that security is always provided by a male protector. So I think everyday violence is integral to the Women, Peace and Security agenda. That is what it tries to put on the agenda. It tries to say that we need to take seriously women and girls and children's experiences of violence and conflict, and that conflict is not something contained just in what the Security Council considers to be a conflict. However, there's real limits within our institutions to fully take on that feminist conception. So then it's up to actors at all other levels to respond to different types of violence and to respond in a way that tries to prevent the continuum of violence. So I think there's really close connections here. We know that rates of gender-based violence and domestic and family violence are much higher among military families. We know that they're much higher in war zones. We know that gender-based violence increases in situations of crisis, including COVID-19. We know this now, and so we should not just be trying to prevent war. We should be trying to prevent violence and violent responses to crises. And sadly, this year, one of the first responses of many countries to a health pandemic has been to increase their defence spending, because they are perceiving that this is going to be a more chaotic world and therefore they need more defence. But in fact, they need more health and education in order to build back better from a global pandemic. So we can see then that our usual way of operating is deeply gendered, but also deeply problematic for most people in the world. So I really concur with the spirit of your question there. And I think we need to keep pushing the Women, Peace and Security agenda to address all the forms of violence and not just those that are recognizable to powerful states. And with regard to your second question about how is Women, Peace and Security challenging or countering women as innately peaceful, that is always really, really hard, because there are some actors who continually want to redefine women, peace and security in precisely the way that activists have tried to challenge, for more than a century. And I think one way that they are is trying to also highlight the fact that men and boys are affected by sexual and gender-based violence. And we actually empirically know that now, and that that often we haven't provided institutions or protection or effective responses to men and boys because we've assumed that only women and girls are affected by this type of violence. So Women, Peace and Security has brought this type of violence and put it on the security agenda, and now they're really trying to broaden that to ensure that we have inclusive responses to all of those who are victims and survivors of this type of violence. Another way in which Women, Peace and Security is addressing the essentialism of Women as Peaceful is by taking on the Countering Violent Extremism agenda. And, you know, in violent extremism today, we see many women, you know, joining these groups and conducting violence and participating in violence, not only in combat roles, but in roles that support and facilitate that violence. And so Women, Peace and Security is trying to understand the ways, the gender constructions and the ways in which women and men are recruited in gender specific ways in order to encourage them to support and engage in violence. So I think we'll see much more of this in the future. And I would say to all of you, please don't be put off by the name of the agenda, which none of those scholars would have probably come up with. But understand Women, Peace and Security as an ongoing debate, as a site of contestation for all of those who want to promote a more just and more inclusive world.
Yeah, thanks so much, Jacqui, and also Rebecca for asking your question. I think we have exceeded the time by a little, but this has been an absolutely fascinating discussion. Thank you so much, Jacqui, for spending your evening and even night talking to us about such an important issue. And thank you for those based in the UK for waking up slightly earlier to tune into such a wonderful talk. So thank you so much. Just a quick reminder that the links to our social media pages can be found in the chat as well. And please also stay tuned for our next event, which will be occurring this coming Thursday, actually, and it will be a debate on nature versus nurture. So thank you so much, and it has been a great time talking to you, Jacqui. Thank you so much.
Thank you so much, Callista. Wonderful questions, and thanks to everybody who came along tonight or in the morning. All the best for your studies.
Yes, thank you so much.